Chapter 4 The Apartment on the Corner. After 10 wretched years of searching, king and queen despaired of ever again seeing their beautiful Morin alive. The land mourned her loss, and prepared for war against any forces Vale may have been amassing. The people grieved, until a rumor reached the palace that Princess Morin had not been slain by Vale after all, but instead had been so violently cast out of Mendelora that she had passed into the other world. My dreams that night ranged across the whole spectrum of weird. At one point I thought I was a bird of some kind, soaring high above rolling hills and into deep valleys. At another point I dreamed of my mother, bent over that man in the grass, but the man didn't vanish this time. Instead he rose up and tried to chase me. I tried to run, but couldn't, my legs resisting movement like they always do in dreams when I really need to get away. The next morning, I woke up in a funk, my head aching and my mind still racing. The twins need new bedtime story material, I grumbled to Daniil as I stumbled out of bed and headed for the bathroom. Why's that? Daniil asked as she began to dress. I thought you loved that old book of stories. I thought they loved it too. I do, and they do, but I had the worst dreams about it last night. I reached the door of the bathroom, but stopped before I went in, my hand on the knob. I looked back at my sister. Daniil? She paused amid dressing and looked up. What's up, Maney? I tried to think of what I really wanted to say, but it involved so many vague worries and confusion that I finally just gave up with a wave of my hand. It's just everything. Everything? Daniil asked. That's a lot of things. Ha, I grunted. Yeah. Anything you want to talk about? I considered. No, not yet anyways, but thanks. Daniil shrugged. Suit yourself. We all eventually congregated around the breakfast table with a minimum of fuss. Even the twins and Russell were subdued this morning, all three of them eating their cereal in silence. Dad looked like he was back to his normal cheerful self, although he did give me a longer glance than usual when I entered the room. Perhaps it was just because I held the packet that Miss Morrow had given me. I nodded to Dad in greeting and dropped the packet on the table before serving myself some cereal. He cleared his throat. I assume I have to sign at least one of those papers, he said to me. Just show me where. I handed him the top sheet. This is the parental permission form. That's pretty much all you have to sign. It just says that they can background check me and stuff. Dad looked the paper over before signing at the bottom. Looks fine to me, he said, handing it back to me. What happens now? Is Stephanie Morrow going to be at school today to finish things up with you? I nodded. She said I can even meet the first child I'll be working with today. I'm not sure who it is yet, but she says it's close enough from school for us to walk. Once I'm done there, I'll just walk back home, so don't bother waiting for me in the line today. Even better, Dad replied, smiling and brushing the top of my head with a kiss. I'm proud of you, kiddo. I blushed and dug into my breakfast. As I ate, I noticed Juliana staring at me over her bowl of toasted oats, a meaningful look in her eye. When I got tired of the staring, I put down my spoon with a sigh and folded my hands. What, Juliana? Did you tell Daddy yet? She prompted me. I made a face at her. Tell him what? I asked, completely in the dark. You know, Juliana continued, as if I was supposed to know what she was talking about. No, I don't know, Jules, I snapped back under my breath. What are you talking about? The book. What book? I asked. It was a stupid question. As soon as she said book, I knew what she was babbling about. I opened my mouth to speak again, but Juliana cut me off. Daddy, the princess book has stuck pages in it, she blurted out. Russell stopped eating and looked up. Huh? What do you mean, Jules? Even Daniil looked intrigued. I could feel my face flush. We got partway through the chapter last night, I explained to Dad, and the pages wouldn't turn anymore. Like somebody spilled something on the pages and they got stuck together? Dad frowned and narrowed his eyes. That's a very valuable book. Did anyone spill something on it? Anyone here? 5 heads shook no, including mine. I even volunteered that the book had stayed in my possession for years on top of my shelf, and that there was little chance for anybody to spill anything on it, since we only took it out at bedtime to read. Dad sighed. This is not good. Leave it with me later today, Germaine, and I'll see what I can do. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. Oh, and Germaine, we won't be home when you get back from your new job since we're picking up Grandma and Aunt Annalyn after school. All right, backpacks on. Let's go. Stephanie Morrow sat waiting for me in the cafeteria when I arrived at school, her hair even poofier today than it had been the day before. Her eyes sparkled, and she beckoned me over when she saw me. Miss Germaine, she cried, good to see you. I hope you brought me some paperwork today. I plopped my backpack down on the table next to her and unzipped the main pocket. I sure did, I said, producing the packet with a flourish like I was a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. I filled most of it out last night, but there were a few spots I wasn't sure about. Oh, that's perfectly fine, Miss Morrow replied, retrieving the half-moon glasses from around her neck and putting them on. We just need proof that you are who you say you are, that you aren't a hardened criminal, and that you can legally work in the state of Virginia. I smiled at her. Can I be just a criminal, as long as I wasn't a hardened one? Miss Morrow laughed heartily. I knew I liked you. You're going to be perfect for this job. Your father talked you up quite a bit last night on the phone, too. I'm eager to see what we can accomplish. I sighed with embarrassment. That's nice of him, but he didn't have to do that. Miss Morrow laughed again and touched my shoulder. Dearie, that's what parents do. If he wasn't embarrassing you one way or another, I'd worry that he wasn't really your father. That made me laugh, and soon we were chatting about the job again until the first bell rang. I shouldered my backpack and flitted off to my classroom, my heart light but butterflies in my stomach. This afternoon would be my first big test, and I was nervous. As Miss Morrow put it, the family would be picking me, not the other way around. I hope they liked me. After a dragging day of school during which I only got to see Sean Ellis once as he went to gym class, I found myself sitting on the front steps of the main building waiting for Miss Morrow to show up. Dad had already swung in to pick up my siblings, so I sat alone with my thoughts as I watched the last few parents leave with their kids. It felt a little lonely, watching other people's parents come to pick up their kids. I realized that I was sitting here waiting to be taken to a real job that paid real money. Kind of like I was a real adult. Scary thought. My 16th birthday was right around the corner, too, making me feel even more grown up. To sleep, perchance to dream, a cheerful voice clucked from behind me. I turned to see Stephanie standing there at the top of the steps. She grinned and came over to sit next to me. You just look like a dreamer to me, sitting there watching the world go by. Wasn't Hamlet talking about the sleep of death when he said that? I asked, amused at her quote. Miss Morrow laughed. I've been found out. You know your Shakespeare. I know enough to cause trouble, I replied. Very good, she declared, rubbing her hands together. Well, did you care to take a walk with me down the street? We're only about 5 or 10 minutes away from where you'll be working. I nodded, although I'm sure the nervousness showed in my face. Miss Morrow? Call me Stephanie, honey. Okay, Stephanie. I tapped my foot on the sidewalk, trying to form my words. What do I do if the family rejects me? Do you just move them on to the next person? And what am I supposed to do with the kid I'll be working with? Do I talk to her or just to her parents? How does this all work? Stephanie linked her fingers around one knee and rocked as she spoke. Well, first of all, the subject that we're visiting today is a he, not a she. He's 9 years old and he has autism, or so the doctors think. Oh, I replied, reassured. Okay. One of my cousins has autism. I know a little bit about it. I used to watch his therapy sessions. Stephanie nodded as she rocked. That's a good start. This case is a pretty severe one if it is autism. His therapist is calling it autism, but she's not entirely sure yet. You'll have to just play it by ear. She stood up and slung her purse over her shoulder, motioning to me to follow her. Remember, she reminded me, don't assume you know what these families need, what these kids need. You'll have to improvise, go with the flow. You're starting to scare me, I confided, only half joking. I'm sorry, I don't mean to. Just keep your head on straight and this'll all make sense. It's okay to be nervous. But remember, they're just people. Normal, everyday people that need a little help. We walked for 2 blocks down a quaint side street, where the old shop windows had been filled with modern electronics, musical gear, and insurance displays. We then made a left turn towards the residential section, where a 3-story brick apartment building dominated one corner of the block. It was an old building from the turn of the last century, fronted by a tall stand of pine trees that nearly brushed the power lines overhead. Although not a wealthy section of town, the area was tidy and neat, if a little plain. Here we are, Stephanie declared, stepping up onto the front stoop of apartment number 4 and ringing the doorbell. She glanced over at me with a smile. Mrs. Ellis is always glad to see people from our agency, she bubbled. She's got her hands full, no question. My stomach tingled a warning. Mrs. Who? Ellis. Stephanie gave me a sidelong glance. Do you know her? I know her older son goes to your school. When I heard that, my stomach dropped out completely. Great. Now I'm going to be a nervous wreck, I thought. Maybe Sean wasn't home yet. Or maybe he would ignore me completely. But did I want him to ignore me? I've seen Sean at school, but I don't know his mom, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Well, Stephanie replied, aware of my discomfort but unwilling to pry. Now's your chance to meet the whole family. As she spoke those last words, I heard the rattle of a security chain scraping out of its track before the door swung open, revealing the last person I had the nerve to face today. Sean Ellis stood in the doorway, glancing at Stephanie and me in turns with his sharp brown eyes. His lean body filled the space with rigid energy, and his hand on the door shone pearly white under an intense grip. The expression on his face was nearly impenetrable, but I thought that I could detect a streak of anger. That surprised me for some reason. Or maybe not anger, I thought. Perhaps just unhappiness. I couldn't tell which it was, but that moment of distraction relieved me of some of my self-consciousness. His gaze came to rest on me, but when he spoke, he was clearly talking to Stephanie. Is this the new attendant? He asked, his eyes boring into my face. The self-consciousness returned with a fury, and I cringed inside. I'd rarely seen him angry at school, and when he had been, it hadn't been directed at myself. But now I felt like he wanted to light me on fire, and I had no idea why. I decided in a moment of desperation not to wait until Stephanie introduced me, and instead I stuck out my own hand. Hi, I said, my voice cracking. I don't know if you remember me from class. I'm Germaine. The fire in his eyes cooled slightly, but when he took my hand, it was clear he was still hostile. Otherwise, I would have been tingling with excitement to be touching him at all. His hand felt warm, the skin of his palm roughened by his constant contact with the football. As I shook his hand, I felt the rigidness in his whole figure relax a little, and a thrill of strange happiness twanged down my spine. He bit the inside of his cheek and withdrew his hand, gesturing for us to come inside. I'll go get Mom. Hold on a second. I stepped inside as Sean ran down the hallway into a back room. Stephanie followed me in. I turned to her, hoping my expression conveyed how out of my depth I felt. She read me correctly and smiled. You haven't blown your chances yet, Germaine, she said under her breath, touching my arm. Sean is an acquired taste. His dad was killed in the Middle East several years ago, and Sean hasn't been the same ever since. I blinked at her in surprise. Oh no, I had no idea. Stephanie shrugged. Most people don't know. He doesn't like to talk about it. He's very protective of his whole family now, and you're a newcomer. I sighed. As if this wasn't awkward enough. Before Stephanie could ask what I meant, Sean had returned with a woman in tow. Mrs. Ellis surprised me with how young she looked. She had the identical deep brown eyes of her oldest son, with the same sort of lean figure as Sean, but much more petite. Her long dark hair had been pulled back in a banana clip, and she wore a simple t-shirt and yoga pants. Her face looked beautiful and exhausted at the same time, a quiet face that hid tragedy well behind a mask of southern charm. "You must be Germaine Anderson," she said with a smile as she extended a hand. Her voice was an alto, strong but soft. I shook her hand and smiled back. "I must be," I joked. Mrs. Ellis laughed at that. "Good to hear. I'd hate to have that mixed up." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, liking her immediately. Some people I just get along with right away, and I felt like she would be one of those people. Her laugh sealed the deal. It reminded me of Mama's. Mrs. Ellis showed us both into the slightly shabby kitchen at the back, where she sat us down at her small square table and asked if we wanted coffee or tea. I selected tea, and Stephanie took coffee. Sean followed us to the kitchen door but stayed there, leaning against the doorframe as the rest of us gathered to talk. I tried to ignore him. Stephanie spoke up first. "As I told you before, Caroline, Germaine will be available every weekday, right after school, to help you. She's worked with her cousin who's in a similar situation as Peter, so she kinda knows what to expect." Mrs. Ellis nodded. "I'm glad to hear that." She glanced over at me. "Do you like dinosaurs, Germaine?" I raised an eyebrow. "Dinosaurs? I don't know, I guess I do. Is that a job requirement?" Mrs. Ellis laughed heartily, and I saw the worry lines around her eyes shrink as she did so. "Peter loves dinosaurs. I just figured I'd give you some warning before we head upstairs to meet him. He probably won't talk about anything else." "Oh," I replied, chuckling. "Okay." We hashed out my work schedule and duties, then Stephanie went over the more boring paperwork with the two of us. All the while, Sean lurked in the doorway, observing the three of us with his unreadable expression. I stole a few glances his way, but didn't dare look for very long. It was clear that my presence in the apartment was a problem for him. Perhaps he felt like I was an intruder? Someone who didn't deserve to be there? I couldn't know unless I asked, and I had no stomach to ask. It made my heart ache to be so close to him, only to have him bristle at my presence. When the discussion was finally over, Mrs. Ellis ushered us upstairs to Peter's room. The atmosphere on the second floor felt stuffy and warm. Mrs. Ellis apologized as she explained that the air conditioning up there didn't work. "The landlord is supposed to fix it, but he takes his sweet time about everything," she sighed. "In the meantime, we keep the windows open and pray for a breeze." She knocked on a closed bedroom door. "Peter, your new attendant is here. I'm coming in." She pushed the door open. We looked into a drab little room with faded blue carpeting and a strange shade of tan paint on the walls. Two beds stood on opposing sides of the room, both made up with homemade quilts. In the middle of the room on the floor sat a box of plastic dinosaurs, and next to the box sat a boy. Peter was small for his 9 years. A pair of skinny legs tangled in front of him, and freckles peppered his skinny arms. His button-nosed face hid behind a shock of tawny hair that hung into his eyes. He didn't look up at the group of people that had entered his room, but instead kept both hands on a green T-Rex that he cuddled against his chest. I recognized that distant look in his blue eyes instantly. I had seen it before in my cousin, who could only be called back to reality with concerted and patient effort. But what struck me the most as I entered was the oppressive presence of something in the room. It was a feeling that had nothing to do with the broken air conditioning. In fact, my skin went goose-pimply as I walked in, like the crawling of your skin when you walk into a freezer. I glanced anxiously around the room, expecting to see something out of order. But the room looked no different than any other bedroom I'd ever seen, except shabbier. So why did it feel haunted? Mrs. Ellis approached the boy on the floor, kneeling next to him and waiting until Peter acknowledged her presence with a brief glance. "Peter, Do you remember what we talked about today? You're getting a new attendant. She spoke in hushed but audible tones, prompting him gently. She's here right now. Did you want to show her your dinosaurs? How about you start by showing her your T-Rex? Peter gave his mother a suspicious sidelong glance before rocking back and forth. I don't want to give her my T-Rex, he said in a sullen tone. I want to keep it. You don't have to give her your T-Rex, Mrs. Ellis replied patiently. Just show it to her. She likes dinosaurs. Peter looked doubtful, but he turned toward the door anyway. His eyes fixed on mine, and he stared hard at me. I thrilled as I realized that he was really looking at me, unlike the way my cousin refused to focus on me. At the same moment, I realized that the swirling, amorphous cold surrounding me had intensified, prompting me to shiver. The something in the room pulsed with vicious energy, coalescing around the figure of the little boy. I could see nothing amiss, but a stirring in me deeper than sight told me that something was very wrong. I glanced at Mrs. Ellis, expecting her to notice the problem, but she had turned to Stephanie to give her an update on Peter's weekly progress. Stephanie didn't seem to notice either, chatting as if nothing was wrong. But Peter continued to stare, regarding me with a look like he recognized me, or recognized something about me. I couldn't be sure which. I approached him at a snail's pace, muscling past the reflex to run from the room, and kneeled down in front of him. Hello, I whispered. Peter cocked his head at me, his eyes firmly locked on my face. He said nothing, but his gaze told me he understood. I'm Germaine, I continued, reclining next to him and spreading my skirt around my knees. He remained silent, but it was the silence of expectation, like he was waiting for me to say more. He acted unlike any child with autism I'd ever seen. I like dinosaurs, I said, reaching into the box for a stegosaurus. Do you like the T-Rex? Peter asked. The T-Rex is a predator, that's why its teeth are as sharp as razors. Do you like the T-Rex? I do like it, I said, electrified by his response. I felt like I was getting somewhere. Is there another T-Rex in this box? No, this is the only one. It's mine. Okay. I'm not going to take it away from you, but can you hold it up so I can see it? I wasn't sure he would, but it couldn't hurt to ask. He held up the figurine and grabbed the mouth to open it. The T-Rex is a predator. That's why it has razor-sharp teeth, he repeated. That's neat, I said, my excitement increasing. He was warming to me, or so it seemed. To my astonishment, he suddenly pushed the T-Rex into my hands and declared in a loud voice, I like Germaine. She can have my T-Rex. It's my T-Rex, but she can play with it if she wants. He then raced to his bed, where he jumped up and wrapped himself in his quilt. Go away, Mom. I want to play with Germaine. Both his mother and Stephanie stared at Peter in wonder. Then his mother turned to stare at me. Her face told a story of relief and gratitude. I thought I may have even seen tears in her eyes. He's never done that with anybody, she whispered to me. Not with family, not with any of his other attendants. My stomach turned a little ill with a sudden thought. How many attendants has he had before me? I dared to ask. You're the 8th, Mrs. Ellis admitted. The 8th attendant in a row. I tried to process that. No one else had stayed. No one. 7 other people had attempted to help the poor boy without success. What made Stephanie think that I could help him any better? Why hadn't she told me about all this? I was about to take Stephanie to task about it, when the something in the room suddenly swarmed into my consciousness again, with a viciousness I was not prepared for. I staggered to my feet and turned to run, but no one noticed my reaction, because at the same moment, Peter began to scream at his mother at the top of his lungs, Get out, Mom! Get out! Get out! We cleared the room at once, Mrs. Ellis nearly pushing us out before closing the door again. Her shaking hands and pale face told me everything I needed to know about Peter's tantrums. She'd been through plenty of these before. "I'm sorry about that," she apologized. "If you want the job, Germaine, then I'd be happy to let you try, if you want it." I nodded numbly, shaking her hand before heading downstairs with Stephanie. We could still hear Peter shouting as we returned to the front foyer. I officially started work tomorrow, and now I knew what I was getting myself into. Mrs. Ellis showed us to the door, gave my hand another squeeze, then shut herself inside. Sean sat on the front steps, brooding, and he moved aside as we walked back down to the sidewalk. Stephanie flashed me a quick smile, whispered some words of encouragement into my ear, then bade me farewell as she walked away. I had told her beforehand that I preferred to walk home alone, and I was glad of it now, because I had a lot to think about. Before I could turn in the other direction, however, Sean stood and stepped down onto the sidewalk. My heart nearly seized in my chest as I watched him approach. He stopped a few feet from me and put his hands in his pockets. "Did you take the job?" he asked. His demeanor had changed to mere suspicion rather than outright hostility. That was encouraging, sort of. "I did," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He frowned at me, and with the frown came that feeling of something present, this time rushing past me. The cold, the pricking of fear. What was it? Whatever it was, it affected Sean too, but not in the same way as Peter. Sean's eyes were clear but dark with distrust. "Other people have tried to help," he muttered. I swallowed. "Okay." "Didn't work then," Sean replied. "Why do you think you'll be able to help him now?" "I'm going to try," I said. "Peter likes me, I think." "You think?" Sean scoffed, his voice turning vicious. "I could hear Peter screaming from out here. What does it matter what you think you can do?" I opened my mouth to shout back at him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. He stood glaring at me, waiting for an answer, but no answer would come. I was too consumed with sudden anger and frustration. I turned on my heel and stalked away so that he wouldn't see my tears. I heard the apartment door slam behind me, and I broke down sobbing, rushing to the street sign at the corner. I wanted my mother. I wanted Sean to like me. And I wanted to know what the horrible haunted feeling was that surrounded this troubled place. What had Stephanie gotten me into? What had I gotten myself into? I grabbed the signpost for support, wishing with all my might that I could help, wishing that everything was different, wishing that I was different. "Why?" I cried to no one in particular. "Why can't everything just be right?" As if the universe had answered my call, the signpost next to me suddenly slipped out of my grasp, and I fell. But it was not the sidewalk I fell onto. It was as if the world had swallowed itself whole and spat me through a tunnel. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. With a sickening rush, the apartment, street corner, trees, signpost, pavement, and blue sky vanished, and I plunged headlong into a gray mist. I closed my eyes in terror as I fell, and when I opened them again, all I saw was grayness. Everything was gray, as if shrouded in a fog that sucked the color from all that it touched. The city of Shanesville was nowhere to be found. I sprawled in a dark clearing in the middle of a darker forest, all by myself.